So, Salman, what are we two Bombay boys doing here?
I don't know, drinking warm white wine.
Yeah,
as opposed to the more traditional whiskey soda.
so it's
But
been,
I should just say, given that we're in this building, which is for the other kind of American Indian, that long before that, this was the customs house of the city of New York, and you may not know that upstairs was the desk where Herman Melville sat
oh really?
and worked when he was writing Moby Dick. So you're in the house. Mr. Melville is in the house.
Inside the whale.
Yeah, exactly. We're inside the whale. Exactly. But I've always, been kind of moved coming into this building because of that history. One of the very greatest novels was written by somebody who was working here as a clerk at the time. So,
But
respect.
so let's talk a bit about your being in Manhattan. We can sort of work back to Bombay because I'm sure this audience wants to hear about Bombay. I was surprised that you came here, but I hadn't been in touch with you for very long, and so I was curious about why you initially came and what it felt like to leave England. Was it sort of liberating?
First of all, I've now been here for 15 years, so I think I qualify. Actually, the thing about being in New York is that you become a New Yorker if you've been here for 2 weeks. So, all you have to do is say that you are, and you are. This is not true of London.
Of London?
No, or Paris, or many other cities they're less welcoming than this city. Which one of the things I love about New York is that it lets you in. But I've always wanted to live in New York since I was a kid. When I first came here in the early 70s, when I was 24, 20, something like that, which was, of course, a very different New York. It was the time of the New York Underground. The city was broke.
Yeah.
It was dirty. There was a lot of crime, so it's exactly the same. But it was also, of course, that extraordinary moment of the arts in New York, whether it was Warhol or Mapplethorpe or the music, the Velvet Underground and the Ramones and Blondie and television and the North Pole and South Pole of New York in those days. The South Pole was CBGB's.
Yes, which is
now,
shut down.
Which is now a clothes shop. And the North Pole was Max's Kansas City. Max's Kansas City was right next to what is now the W Hotel on the corner of Union Square. Now it's a delicatessen. But it used to be the coolest place in town, where everybody used to go. And upstairs from Max's Kansas City, there was a very small performance space in which the Velvet Underground were the house band for a month, and that's what launched them. Debbie Harry worked as a waitress at Max's Kansas City, and then later came back with her band. So, I came to New York at that time and fell in love. I just thought, this is the place to be.
So this is the 70s?
Yeah, like 73,
Right.
like that.
Right.
Yeah. And then I finally made it.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And do you find that the creative juices really...
I think, the thing that people say all the kinds of usual stuff about New York, one of the things that nobody says about New York is, I think, a very obvious fact about it, which is that it's an incredibly hard-working town.
Yeah.
Everybody works really hard.
Right.
And as a result, it's a very easy city to work hard in.
Yeah.
Because everybody else is, and you feel like an idiot if you're not. In London you can take 3-hour lunches and drink 2 bottles of wine, and so is everybody else. So
in London.
Everybody still drinks at lunchtime in London. It's one of the big differences. Although they're beginning to acquire American habits.
Yeah.
And drinking fizzy water.
No, you know, you say it's a very welcoming city, but and I remember reading, I forget the title of the book. It's sort of part biography, part novella by Elizabeth Hardwick, set in New York. Does anybody remember? Sleepless Nights,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
And she says, not just that it's welcoming, but that it's a city that's very hospitable to single people, because, you know, she'd just come out of a marriage with Robert Lowell, I think, and so describes how kind it is to single people, which you know.
Well, I have sometimes been a single person in New York. And at other times not. So I have both experiences. But I have an Elizabeth Hardwick story about India, actually. I only met her once ever, and I was sitting next to her at a dinner that was given for Susan Sontag. And I'd never met her before, you know. And she was either a little drunk or she was affecting drunkenness in order to be able to say outrageous things. And she'd just been to India. This was just about the time that Midnight's Children had come out. And she'd just been to India, and she said to me, "Dear, I hated it. So dirty. Everybody wants your money. People push you. It's so smelly. And dear, your book captured it perfectly." It was kind of the best backhanded compliment. No, what do you say to that? Thank you. Anyway, Elizabeth Hardwick.
Yeah. So do you find that it's your habits of writing and so on are different here than they were in England?
No. I mean, you know, I have to say the one thing that I developed quite early on was real writing discipline. I mean, I don't have discipline in the rest of my life, as anybody knows, you know. But writing, I really do. I mean, and from a very early age, I was just able to sit down and just do it like an office job. You know, you sit down in the morning, do a day's work, stop. And I still can. I mean, it's one of the few things that you learn from experience.
Right. But do you do it during office hours, 9 to 5?
More or less, yeah. More or less.
All through the day?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I get up and go for a walk, but basically, yeah, I can't work early in the morning, like some people. You know, Martin Amis gets up really early and works until lunchtime, from like 6 a.m. until lunchtime. And then he has the rest of the day to drink and play tennis. You know, but I'm not so fortunate. I can work late at night.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a habit that when I'm writing a book, that at night, before I go to bed, I always try and read what I wrote that day, just before going to sleep. And then, you know, sometimes it needs a little fixing, and sometimes it needs more than that, and sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, it's a very good way of having the book in your mind when you go to sleep, so it's in your mind when you wake up in the morning, and then you can continue.
Right.
I mean, Hemingway had that famous sentence that you should always write one sentence less than you know. You know? So if you know what is the first sentence you're going to write down in the morning, gets you started.
Yes.
It's a good trick.
And I think once when we were talking, you said that the first sentence of novels mean a lot to you. I mean, that it's they're sort of mobilizing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember hearing, I saw a talk by Joseph Heller, the author of Catch-22. And Joe Heller said that his books were very often inspired by sentences. That he would think of a sentence and understand that there were 200 other sentences that followed from it. And he said Catch-22 was like that, and Something Happened was like that. You know, in the office in which I work, there are 6 people of whom I'm afraid. That was the sentence that came to him, and then he knew how to. And sometimes it's been like that with me. I mean, it was like that with Haroun and the Sea of Stories, for example.
Right.
Where I had great difficulty writing that book in finding the correct tone of voice for it.
Yeah.
Because I wanted it to be accessible to younger readers, but interesting to adults. You know, and the problem there is it's too easy to make it too childish. It's easy to make it too adult.
Yes.
Where's that line to walk? You know, and then one day I just sat down and wrote what essentially is the first sentence of Haroon, which is, you know,
This is the Alif Bay.
there was once in the city of a country of Alif Bay, a sad city.
Yeah, right.
You know, city so impossibly sad that it had forgotten its name. And then the second sentence, which contained the glumfish, stood by a mournful sea full of glumfish. And I thought, okay, now I know how to write the book. Once the glumfish showed up. And you know, it's just a question of, it's a, you know, it's like a tuning fork. You have a note that you hit.
Yes.
And when you're hitting the note, you think, okay, it's good, it's all right.
Yes.
And that the opening sentence can sometimes give you, and Midnight's Children was like that.
Yes.
You know, because I initially tried to write it as a third-person narrative, not as a first-person narrative. And I wrote a bit, and I kind of didn't like it. You know, I thought it was oddly lifeless. It was kind of inert. And then I thought, well, you know, Salim takes such a long time to be born. There's like 100 odd pages of the novel, you know. And so I thought maybe if he's telling the story so that he's in the book as the storyteller, it'll be easier for the reader to wait for him to actually show up.
Yes.
And so I thought, just try it. And I sat down and the stuff came out of me that truthfully I don't know where it came from. You know, and it was quite clear to me that it was the best paragraph I'd ever written in my life. You know? And I thought, well, just let him talk.
Yes.
You know, I'll just shut up and let him talk. So I did. And and he talked a lot.
Right. And
I was in Delhi just after the book came out, and I was speaking at JNU, and in the session like this, and in the Q&A, there was an unusually beautiful young woman in the front row, and when she stuck up her hand, I said, yes. And she said, Mr. Rushdie, your novel, Midnight's Children, is a very long novel. She said, never mind, I read it through. And my question for you, she said, is the following. Fundamentally, what's your point? You know, I was a little stumped. And I opened my mouth and she said, no, I know what you're going to say. She said, you're going to say that the whole novel from the beginning to the end, that's your point. Isn't that what you're going to say? And I said, well, yeah, I say something like that. And she said, it won't do. I still don't know the answer.
charming. You should tell her there about 100 books, and they've called it post-colonialism.
Yeah. No, I could have made that kind of speech, but it wouldn't do. You know?
So now, let's work backwards. So I'm curious about your time in England during the 60s, you know, because I was a kid in Bombay, in college in Bombay in the late 60s, and I just felt very envious that so much was going on, in both in England
certainly the first half of the 60s, I would much rather have been in Bombay. Because, you know, I'd like you, we were both cathedralites, and you know, it was fun. And boarding school in England was much less fun.
Right.
So 61 to 65, when I was at boarding school, I mean, the 60s, you know, Philip Larkin said that the 60s began in 1963, you know, which was a little late for me, he said. After the assassination of Kennedy and before the Beatles' first LP, you know, something like that. I'm misquoting the poem, but it's like that. Till I went to college, I had this very confined boarding school life, you know. And in the holidays, I would go back because my family was still in Bombay. So So I had this curious life between Bombay, which was
Right.
what it was, and then this small Midlands town, Rugby. Cambridge was different. Cambridge was,
Yeah.
you know, 'cause- and I mean, 1965 to 68
Yeah.
is probably the best 3 years to have been at university in the history of the world.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
You know, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the
Right.
kind of global epicenter of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And of course, I, like the a particular president, I did not inhale.
That's what I meant. You know, I mean, this was a time when every week you could expect a great album from
Yes.
the Beatles or Stones
Yes.
or Dylan,
Yes.
and a great movie.
And the movies, I mean, that certainly the music and the movies,
Yeah.
much more, actually, much more than literature
Yeah.
at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah. So
Certainly English literature
Yeah.
at that time, to my mind, was not so exciting. I mean, there were wonderful writers. There was Doris Lessing and Muriel
Yeah.
Spark and, you know, so on. But there were American writers that I was very attracted to, like the fabulists, you know, like Thomas Pynchon and
Yeah.
so on. And European and South American writers and so on. But
sure.
English literature, not so much. But the movies
Yeah,
and the
the
music.
movies were-
I mean, it's very hard now to tell people what it was like when the movies that are now thought of as the great classics
Yeah.
of the sound cinema were just that week's new movie. You know, this week there's this Italian film called La Dolce Vita.
Yes, right.
You know, next week there's this French film called Pierrot le Fou.
Yeah.
The week after that there's this Spanish film called The Exterminating Angel.
Yeah, right.
The week after that there's this Swedish film called The Seventh Seal. The week after that there's this Indian film called Apur Sansar.
Yeah.
The week after that there's this Japanese film called Rashomon.
Right.
And these were the new movies. You know,
I
it
know,
was
it's
mind-blowing
amazing.
to go
Yeah.
to the cinema.
Yeah.
And I felt there was this little art house cinema in Cambridge called the Arts Cinema.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, now it's a coffee shop like everything else. But I felt that I got my education in that building.
Yeah.
You know, I would go 4 or 5 times a week just to
Right.
be part of this. I mean, it gets collectively called the New Wave. I mean, it's not, I mean, the New Wave was really French, and then there was an Italian New Wave, but it was this extraordinary moment in international cinema,
Yeah.
world cinema, unlike anything that's come after.
Yeah. So all that creative fury was in popular music
Yeah.
and in cinema.
Yeah,
And
very much so. Yeah, and you had to decide. You know, you had to decide between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones,
Yes.
which was a question as important.
And
as
which side were you on?
You know, George Steiner said that the great distinction is between Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Well, the Beatles and the Stones were like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky.
Don't tell me you were on the side of the Beatles.
Initially, I was completely on the side of the Rolling Stones.
Uh-huh.
I have you want my $2 theory on the Beatles and Rolling Stones? It's this. They were both listening to American music a lot. The Beatles were listening to Motown, and the Rolling Stones were listening to Delta Blues. You know, so the Rolling Stones grew up wanting to be black American boys,
Right.
and the Beatles grew up wanting to be black American girls. If you think about they covered "Please, Mr. Postman," you know that they covered all these Motown songs, which were sung by girl groups. You know? Whereas the Beatles the Rolling Stones were all trying to be Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf and so on. You know, which is cooler? Not hard to answer that question.
Right.
But then what happened is the Rolling Stones just stayed exactly the same forever,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the Beatles did something else and became more
Right.
interesting.
Oh, they were the better musicians, but we despised people who preferred the Beatles too. It's just one of those, you know, you just gangs formed on,
Yes,
on
they did.
either side of the.
They did. But then, you know, came the second period, Beatles, after the 2 terrible movies. Once they stopped making terrible movies.
Right.
3 terrible movies if you include Magical Mystery Tour. But then comes Rubber Soul and Revolver and Sgt. Pepper and the White Album. And then Then the argument's over.
Right.
And then the Beatles actually...
And you were a Dylan fan too?
Huh? Yes, Christopher Hitchens and I had an enormous rivalry in quoting Dylan lyrics. Dylan, of course, Christopher had the best memory in the human race. And so you couldn't win because he could recite the whole of Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, which is, you know...
The longest song you wrote, yes, right.
Yeah, exactly. It's like reciting the whole of Paradise Lost, you know. But we did. We used to battle. We used to have battles on
I must tell you all a great story that Martin Amis said about Salman when he was giving a reading in Manhattan many years ago. He said Salman was picking him up somewhere, probably some literary festival or something, at the airport. And Amos came out carrying a Robert Ludlum novel in his hand.
Oh, yeah.
And Salman said, "What the hell are you reading?"
It was like the Rhineman exchange.
Amos said, "You know, I hate flying so much that I just have to read these crappy novels when I fly." And he said, the novels are not the half of it. What's worst are the titles.
The Rhineman exchange.
Right.
The Bourne Ultimatum.
Yes.
The Eiger Sanctions.
So it's always the name of a place followed by
the somewhere
an abstraction.
The somewhere something.
Right, somewhere something, right. So, exactly. So the Bourne Ultimatum and so. And then Amos said, "Can you imagine if Shakespeare gave titles like that to all his plays?" And he said, without a second's pause, Salman said, "Elsinore Vacillations."
Yeah, exactly. No, we went into, you know, the Rialto sanction, you know, the handkerchief misapprehension. That's wonderful. No, unfortunately, one of the great things we've lost is that Hitchens and Martin and I used to play these stupid games. And I made up all the clean word games, and Martin made up all the dirty word games. The best one is the titles that don't work. Movie titles, book titles of anything that don't quite make it. You know, like Mr. Zhivago. And, you know, 2 days in the life of Ivan Denisovich. You know, a farewell to weapons. You know, for whom the bell rings. You know, the Big Gatsby. And since we're in this building, Toby Dick. For which the alternative title was Moby Prick.
Midnight ke bache.
Anyway, so we had hundreds of these. Yeah. The story of the Forsytes. Strawberry Finn.
But so, tell me, did you grow up reading very lofty books? I mean, that's how you were brought up?
No, I mean, I read. I mean, I read a lot. That's for sure. Yeah.
So, what was in your father's library?
Well, I mean, what there was in my father's library, which I did raid every so often, was the Richard Burton translation of The 1001 Nights. And the thing about the Richard Burton translation is that it's not a particularly great translation, but it has unbelievable footnotes. The footnotes are sometimes 2/3 of the page, and they're all about sex. Richard Burton was obsessed with sex and the Arabs somehow went together, as with Lawrence of Arabia, you know.
So was it a lot of homosexuals?
It was every conceivable form of sex. Very interesting for a teenage boy. So I remember the footnotes more than the stories, really. I had to revisit the stories later in order to find out what the stories were.
But not Shakespeare, Milton, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, no. I mean, there was some of that. I mean, I remember that my father used to feel that like he used to feel that the English language teaching at cathedral school
Yeah.
was not quite up to what he would expect. So when I came back, he would set me extra homework. You know, that's a terrible Desi parent thing to do. That I would have to write him essays about, you know, about Antony and Cleopatra and whatever, you know. So it's amazing that I still like Shakespeare after that experience.
You know, I had a very strange experience, and I don't know if this happens to you. I went and saw a Shakespeare play for the first time, which I hadn't read before, and I understood only half of it.
Yeah. Which
you know,
one?
I realized Pericles, which may not even actually be his. It's
Well, the
something
first two acts are not his.
Uh-huh.
The first, no. Shakespeare, I mean, it's clear that he may have written the structure of it.
Right.
But the first two acts are probably written by John Gower. And there's this
Right.
moment at the beginning of Act 3 when Pericles is standing on the seashore
Yeah.
and there's a storm.
Yeah.
And line 1 of Act 3 is Pericles says, "O God of this great vast, rebuke these surges."
Yes.
And you think, whoa, Shakespeare just showed up. You know?
Right.
It's just extraordinary because the first two acts are okay, and then the writing just goes vroom,
Yeah.
like that. And you know, the question is, did Shakespeare know he was Shakespeare?
Right.
You know, I mean, there's a great in the film Shakespeare in Love. There's a moment in which Joseph Fiennes playing Shakespeare. He's writing Romeo and Juliet at the time. You know, and he gets up from his desk and kind of does a little pirouette, and he says, "God, I'm good." And you wonder, did Shakespeare know that? You know, and my view is, you can't write that stuff without knowing it.
Yes.
You know, because even at our more mundane level, every writer knows that when you do something that you really that's actually okay, you know it's okay.
Right.
You know, and you think, don't touch that. Whatever you do, don't mess with that, because that's okay.
Yeah.
You know, and most of us have that experience like once a year. and
Yes.
Shakespeare was writing, you know, 3 plays a year,
Right.
and they were those plays.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I mean, imagine writing Midsummer Night's Dream, Henry IV, Part 1, and, you know, I don't know what, Titus Andronicus, in 1 year.
Yeah.
Most of us would settle for that for a lifetime.
Yeah.
You know. Anyway,
Right.
yes, Shakespeare,
Yeah.
bastard. But fortunately dead.
And he, yeah, sure, he must have known, but I wonder how much authors tend, apart from just knowing that they've got something, get their own stuff right. I've heard, you've written occasionally about your own writing, and I'm just curious, one time you spoke somewhere, I can't remember where now, many years ago, you described your own writing as something with some pride, as having two seemingly paradoxical things. One was a chronic element, a constant element of difficulty. You said that, you know, I think of my work as being difficult.
Oh.
And
I lied. Yeah, right. What else should I
and
say?
that in a sense you even aspire to it, but it's the kind of difficulty, I think you said, which draws people in
Yeah.
rather than puts them off. And that
Yeah.
it was important for you to do that. And I think when we spoke about it, I asked you whether you wanted to make a distinction between difficulty and virtuosity. See, because I've always thought, and this is a slightly impertinent thought, because how do I know? But I've always thought that given the kind of talent you have, that it must be easy for you to do the kind of writing you do.
It's a piece of cake. I just
is to say-
sit home and 500-page novels just fall out.
No, but you know how there's a kind of virtuosity, but you know a certain kind of intelligence is capable.
Well,
for others, it's a cultivated thing.
Well, the thing that I think is right is that a lot of the Indian literary tradition is oral,
Right.
and therefore has something to do with performance.
Yeah.
You know, that in the way that the classical music of India doesn't separate the composer from the performer. They're the same thing. The performance is also the act of creation. And I think there's something about both music and literature in India where performance and creation are very closely associated. And certainly I was, in the beginning more than now really, I was very interested in the oral tradition and the way in which stories were told orally. And that helped me find some of the manner and language of the earlier books, you know. So yeah, in that sense, yes. And I mean, and then I also think that there are writers. I think literature works at both ends. I think literature works when it's minimal and when it's maximal. It doesn't work in the middle. You know, so you can take like one tiny kind of hair from the head of the goddess, you know, and turn it in the light and write about that. That works. Or you can let the crowd in and the carnival and the noise and etc. and write, and that works. Both ends work. Nothing in the middle works much. In the middle is ordinariness. And if you want to not be ordinary, don't go there. So I think, you know, you always envy the people who can do the thing that you don't do. You know, so I envy the writers who can do that very delicate. You know, Raymond Carver. You know, Jane Austen.
And you, I think you think in India, Anita Desai.
Anita, yeah. I mean, Anita very much so, and Narayan. You know, but at the other end, there's this kind of noisy stuff, you know, and I guess I'm in the noisy stuff.
But with sort of caesura in the middle occasionally.
Yeah, no. I mean, I'd like to try the other thing, but I just think, you know, you try and put a world in the book. You know, you can either put like tiny moments, or you can try and put the world. And it's a question of, it's in many ways, it's a temperamental thing. You know, and my temperament has been there.
And your language is geared to that more crowded and...
Well, that's also the question is whether what you do with language. I mean, language again responds to a number of things. You can really restrain yourself. You could pull yourself way back, and that can be very powerful. And I think the book in which I probably did that most is Shalimar the Clown. You know, because there I felt the material was so painful in many ways and tragic. That it needed to not be, the language needed to be not pushed. You know, the language needed to be pulled back. And actually the events gained in power by being under-described. You know? And then sometimes you want to push it to the other extreme, you know, and see how rich it can get.
You know, about language, you talk in one of your essays, which I just read recently, sort of to prep myself to talk today.
So you forced yourself.
And it was a very engaging piece in which you were quietly quite deflating of literary criticism in universities. And you point out how there's a sort of anti-English, he says, you refuse, you say, to take up the cudgels with all these professors about being against English in India and so on. But I do think that what you managed to achieve in a way was the decolonization of English in India, right? So I mean, there is the kind of English that is
no, I mean,
admired.
I tried.
You actually sort of
well, I think what I felt was I was very inspired by the way in which writers around the world had taken possession of English and made it their own. So if you read the poetry of Derek Walcott, if in the West Indies, if you read James Joyce, you know, if you read you know, the greatest Australian writers like Peter Carey and David Malouf and so on. Right. The language becomes their possession. You know, and I suppose it's one of the gifts of English as a language.
Yes.
That it is so malleable that you can do that with it. You know, and I thought, you know, that was, in a way, seeing that, and of course America, par excellence, is the place where English was remade. Right. Not just once, but several times. Right. You know, there's a kind of East Coast Jewish American novel. Right. And then there's a kind of African American novel, there's a Southern American novel, and then there's California. Yeah. Which we don't have to speak of. Right. But you know, there not just one, but many Englishes here. And all of that work of remaking that I read was inspirational. And I thought, well, you know, we can do this too.
But you and maybe before you, Desani and so on, were actually doing things with it, which I think once it's set into the sensibility, then people who think of English in this high terms, this Macaulay, those people began to be despised, whereas they were hero worship.
Yes, I know. What can you do? Desani, I mean, All About H. Hatter is, of course, an important book. Yeah. But what Desani completely forgets to do is tell a story. He doesn't tell any stories.
Yes,
the book just sits there. It doesn't move, you know. So any individual paragraph of it is brilliant. Yes. And 10 pages of it are incredibly annoying. Yes, because it doesn't go. Come on, get on with it. Yes. But there are brilliant things. I mean, his translation into English of the names of Gandhi and Nehru. Yes. So Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi becomes action slave, fascination moon, grocer. Anyway, so yes, this idea is great fun, and I liked him.
Yeah, and some of your work now, I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Enchantress and so on. They've come to rely a lot on things that a bit of learning. I mean, you've really had to you know, more so than.
Well, I just have always been, you know, I mean, I'm a history student, you know, I mean, my degree was in history.
Yes, and of course, Satanic Verses.
And so I've always, I think all these books, sometimes the history is contemporary history, and sometimes it's long time. I mean, Midnight's Children is rooted in a particular moment of history. And shame. Yeah,
but you wear it light. You know, the thing is that I won't mention names, but actually I admire those novels too. But there are writers in India who have a lot of learning, but they sound like professors in their novels.
Mention names.
Well, Amitav, whose work I admire a lot. Yeah. But it sometimes comes off as a discourse on anthropology. You know,
well, it is a difficulty. I think it's a trap, because obviously, if you study a period as rich as, in his case, the Opium Wars, but in the case of the Enchantress, this extraordinary parallel moment of the Italian Renaissance and the height of the Mughal Empire.
Exactly, yeah, you know? Right.
I mean, they're amazing periods. You know, they're so interesting and so rich that it became quite clear to me that I could have written a 1,000-page novel. I could have been Vikram Seth, you know. You know, a suitable emperor. And I just thought, I don't want to do that, because there was something about the story that I was trying to tell, which needed to be, it needed to be not encumbered by a lot of that stuff. So I remember I pinned up a piece of paper above my desk which said, only if it helps the story, only if it serves the story. Yeah. And then there was it was a very useful, it was a kind of Occam's razor, you know, it was a way of saying, no, okay, it's interesting, but that's not the story I'm telling. You know, and that became a kind of liberation.
Yeah.
And it became that iceberg thing, you know, if you know 10 times as much as you show,
Yes. Then
it actually helps.
Yeah.
But it doesn't help if you show it all.
Right. So it grounds it, but doesn't display it. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are things, it made me fall in love with the act of research, actually, because I found out things that I would never in a million years have known.
Yeah.
For instance, when this girl, this princess of the Morel court is gradually adventuring her way across the world, you know, ending up in Italy, there's a moment where she passes through the Ottoman Empire. And I discovered, I wanted to jump up and down, that at this particular moment, the Ottoman Empire went to war with Dracula, with actual Dracula. Vlad Dracul, Vlad Dracul, the Impaler. And I thought, amazing, I can have Dracula in my novel, and I'm not even cheating. and there are these just incredible gifts that research will give you. There's no way I would ever have been able to. I mean, he's only there for a page, but Dracula makes a guest appearance. And so, yeah, you find out amazing things. But the secret, I think, is that of remembering that you're telling a story.
Right.
And trying to make sure that whatever you use is in the service of that.
Right. But the Bombay settings are memory. They're not learning, right? I mean, they're just...
well, I mean, Bombay was initially memory, and then it was learning.
And then it was learning. You mean the Mosla side?
Well, I mean, I just mean that even when you think you know about something, that's usually when you make terrible mistakes. You know, so in a way, especially when you think you know about something, you should check. You know, otherwise you misquote the poem.
Right.
You know, you get the date wrong.
Yes.
You get and so even in about material which I felt I knew as kind of lived experience.
Right.
I still felt I have to go and check so I'm not being stupid.
Yeah.
My relationship with Bombay at this time, well, it's a different place, you know. It's I guess when I wrote the Moors La Salle, I was talking about the transition from Bombay into Mumbai. And I don't feel I know it as well as I used to, because there's just so much more of it to know. And I don't feel that I like it as much as I used to, because it's not quite as likable. But there we are, I'm stuck with it. In what is now called South Bombay, which when we were growing up was just called Bombay, that little world now feels stuck on the end of this big city that's over here, you know. And I mean, I've sort of got to know it a little bit, but I don't know, it's less lovable, that's for sure.
You've read the Suketu Mehta's account?
Maximum City, yeah, sure.
It's certainly not the Bombay we grew up in.
No. I enjoyed that book so much. And I mean, he's very funny talking about it, because, you know, he changed the names of several of the gangsters, you know, several of the kind of D Company walas.
Yes.
And the only thing they were annoyed about was that he changed their names. Why do you put our name? And he said, but you know, you're confessing to multiple murders, and so on. It might be not so good for the police. You know? They said, no, you let us worry about the police. You put our name.
Hi, Salman. Wanted to ask you if you could dwell a little bit about your relationship with language. Perhaps like how a lot of us grow up half in South Asia, and then we migrate, and a lot of our imagination is influenced by several languages we speak regionally. You know, Urdu, Punjabi, at least in my case, and acquired on the way, Farsi, whatever. But I write mostly in English. So how has that experience been for you, and could it be inspiration?
Well, I never wrote in Urdu, except letters to my mother, and then she would tell me how terrible my Urdu was. But what is true, I think, is if you have in your head the music of different languages, you know, it's helpful, you know, because it means that whatever language you're writing in, you can sometimes try and change the music. You know, and one of the things I think about Urdu, for example, is that the natural sentence line is a little bit longer than English. And also, the colloquial speech of Urdu is much more richly metaphorical than English. So, you know, you say the sun wakes up. You know, you don't say that in English. So even just the ordinary descriptions of ordinary events, you know, have a kind of poetry and metaphor in the colloquial language, not in the kind of high language, just in the colloquial language, that English doesn't have. Yeah. And so sometimes you can listen to that music and try and do it. Try and do it in the other language and see what happens. See what happens if you take the linguistic techniques of one language and apply them to another language. I mean, you can't do it too much, otherwise it just gets weird. But it becomes a flavor. You know, it becomes like a flavor that you can use. And there are books of mine in which I've done it a lot, and other books of mine in which I really got fed up of doing it. You know, and I think one of the things, I mean, in the Moz Lasai, I invented this language of Bombay, which is called Hugme. It's called Hugme because Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati, Marathi, English. And you put all of it together, combined with Bombay slang, you know, Kali Pili Bom Marta. And you have a language that isn't even spoken anywhere else in India. And it actually reminded me when I saw Blade Runner, in which people in the street are speaking this mixture of English and Martian and Japanese and so on. I thought that's a Bombay Bazaar, you know? And that idea of languages rushing into each other and making some collective other thing, you know, was very interesting to me when like Midnight's Children is sort of has that idea at the back of the head. But you can't do it too much, otherwise, I mean, you have to write the book in some language, you know, otherwise nobody can read the book. But if you have that idea in your head, you can just put a little bit of that in it. Yeah. Yeah.
I was very impressed when I read Moz Lasai at the amazing, it seemed researched, but that was written during the fatwa. And not just Bombay, which would be in your memory, but Kerala, the scenes in Kerala was so detailed. How did you do that?
Well, here's the thing. There's two ways of doing it. One is that writers do this thing called making shit up. and if you do it properly, it feels true. You know? But the other thing is that I actually had been quite often to Kerala, and I had kept quite detailed journals of being there, and had never used them. I just had some instinct which said, don't write a travel article. You know, just put this away and one day it might be. So actually when I came to set this part of the book that's in Cochin, I had all this material written down, these notes from earlier visits. And Bombay, I mean, one of the reasons why I was able to, I thought, write about the Shiv Sena is that when I was there I was in Bombay in 1987 making a documentary for British television. And at that time, this man, Chhagan Bhujbal, who had been the first Shiv Sena mayor of Bombay, now he's in the Congress. There we are. Make of that what you will. You know? But at that point, he was completely, you know, Saffron Brigade guy. And he was one of the people in the film. And he gave us incredible access. I mean, we were able to follow him around everywhere for a week or more, including the Ganpati procession and etc. So I was right over his shoulder at the Ganpati procession with all these Sainiks going past, you know, like that. It was kind of just really, I mean, it was really interesting. And so I had this, at least this week or 10 days, really inside the Shiv Sena to write about. You know, and so some of it came from that. There was, I have to tell you, in the Moor's Last Sigh, there's the Shiv Sena, one of the Shiv Sena guys is called Mendak. And the reason for this is that when we were making the film with Chhagan Bhujbal, in his office, in his home, the telephone on his desk was in the shape of a green plastic frog. And every time the phone rang, he would go, and he would pick up the phone. And I went over to the cameraman, sort of very quietly, and I said, "You see the phone?" And he said, "Got it." But then when we looked at the footage, when you see a man talking into a green plastic frog, he's kind of lovable. You can't hate a man who's talking to a green plastic frog. And actually, Chhagan Bhujbal was somebody who it was important to hate. And so we left the frog out of the movie. And even though it was a beautiful moment, we didn't use the frog, but I used the frog in the Moor's Last Sigh. So I got him in the end. There was an amazing moment when he asked me to protect him against the British television company because they would make him look bad. And I said, look, because I'd been interviewing him on camera, you know. And I said, look, you have said on camera, you know, you have described yourself as racist and you have described yourself as fascist. I said, you have said that on camera in a formal interview. I can't defend you against that. And he said, no. He said, that's not a problem. He said, you could call us racist because we are racist. And he said, you can call us fascist because we are fascist. And I said, what is it exactly you want me to protect you against? And he said, they will make me look like a bada admi, like I'm a grand person talking down to the people, but actually I'm a man of the people, I'm an ordinary person. You have to make me look like that. And I said, I'm not sure I could achieve that. You know, but it was interesting that that's what he was worried about. He was worried about being made to seem elitist, but not worried about racism or fascism, which I thought so unlike the present government.
Thank you.